You have until the end of the month, Dad. I'm sorry, but this is how it has to be. That was all she said. My daughter, my own daughter, the little girl I drove to soccer practice every Saturday morning for 6 years, the one who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives back from Muskoka, said those words to me 11 days after we buried her mother. I stood in the hallway of the house I had owned for 31 years, the house where we brought both kids home from the hospital, where my wife Patricia had painted the kitchen yellow twice, because she couldn't decide between Buttercup and Harvest Gold, and eventually just did both. I stood there with my coat still on, snow melting off my boots onto the hardwood, and I could not make sense of what I was hearing. My son-in-law Trevor was standing just behind my daughter. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look on his face said everything. I want to be honest with you, because that's the kind of man I've tried to be my whole life. My name is James. I'm 67 years old. I worked 32 years as a civil engineer for the city of Ottawa. I have 2 children, and I had a wife who was the best person I have ever known. And in the weeks after Patricia died, I came very close to losing everything. Not just her, but my home, my savings, and what little dignity I had left. This is what happened. Patricia was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition in the spring of 2021. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, the doctor said. We could manage it. There were medications, treatments, dietary changes. We could manage it. There were medications, treatments, dietary changes. We adjusted. We were good at adjusting. 38 years of marriage teaches you that. You bend. You figure it out together. What we didn't know was that Trevor had been watching our finances for years. He was a financial advisor. That's how he'd met our daughter Allison at some conference in Toronto back when she was still working in insurance. Smart man. Charming, the way certain people are charming when they need something from you. When Allison brought him home for the first time, Patricia whispered to me in the kitchen, "I don't trust that smile." I told her she was being unfair. I was wrong. She was almost never wrong about people. About 2 years into Patricia's illness, she asked Trevor to help us reorganize our investments. She was tired easily by then, and I was spending most of my energy managing her medications, her appointments, making sure she was comfortable. Our portfolio felt like one more thing I couldn't keep up with. Trevor offered to help. He said it was family. He said he would charge us anything, that he just wanted to make sure we were set up properly for retirement. I trusted him. I want you to understand how completely and how stupidly I trusted him. He moved our RRSPs, he restructured the joint accounts. He set up what he called a family trust arrangement that I signed without reading carefully enough. Because I was exhausted and scared and my wife was sick and he was sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, telling me this was standard practice, totally routine, nothing to worry about. What it actually did, and I didn't understand this until much later, was shift effective control of several of our major assets into a structure that put Allison's name in a position of authority. He'd framed it as estate planning. He'd framed it as protecting Patricia and me. What it actually did was begin the slow, quiet transfer of everything we'd built into his hands. Patricia found out before she died. I didn't know that then, but she found out. She passed in October. Pancreatic cancer had developed secondary to her autoimmune condition. The doctors said sometimes the long-term medication can suppress the immune system in ways that allow other things to take hold. It moved fast once it started. 3 months from diagnosis to the end. I was with her every moment I could be. I slept in the chair beside her hospital bed for the last 2 weeks. Our son, Ryan, flew in from Vancouver. He sat with us. We took turns holding her hand. Allison came when she could. Trevor was always busy. The day after the funeral, Ryan went back to Vancouver. He had a job, 2 young kids, a life that needed him. We hugged in the driveway and he said, "Call me every day, Dad." And I said I would, and I meant it, though I knew we both understood that grief has a way of making you go silent. 11 days later, Allison came to the house with a folder. She sat me down at the kitchen table. Patricia's kitchen table, the one with the ring stain from a mug of tea I'd set down without a coaster in 2009. and Patricia had been mock-furious about for years, and she opened the folder and explained to me, in a voice that was almost clinical, that as part of the trust arrangement, the house had effectively transferred to her name upon her mother's death. She showed me documents. She showed me signatures. Mine. Patricia's. A notary stamp. She said she and Trevor had been planning to develop the property. She said it wasn't personal. She said she was sorry, but I would need to find somewhere else to live. I asked her what she was talking about. She said, "You have until the end of the month, Dad. I'm sorry, but this is how it has to be." I didn't cry until she left. I sat at that table for a long time, in the quiet of a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else, and then I cried in a way I hadn't since I was a child. Deep, ugly crying, the kind that frightens you a little because you didn't know you still had that inside you. I called Ryan that night. He was furious. He said he'd call a lawyer. He said Allison couldn't do this. This wasn't legal. There had to be something wrong with those documents. I told him I didn't know. I told him I'd signed things I hadn't read carefully enough, and I didn't know what I'd signed away. He called her. She didn't answer. He called Trevor. Trevor answered and told him, very calmly, that everything had been done legally and properly, that Patricia had agreed to the arrangement, and that unfortunately this was just how the estate had been structured. Ryan drove to Ottawa 3 days later. He was ready for a fight. But when we sat down and he looked at the documents, his face changed. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, we need a lawyer. A real one, not Trevor." I found one. A woman named Patricia. Different Patricia, just a coincidence that made me catch my breath every time I said her name for the first month, who specialized in estate law and elder financial abuse. She was thorough and she was kind, and she told me what I had suspected, that the documents were structured in a way that was technically legal, but had been deliberately designed to obscure what they were actually doing. She said she'd seen this before. She said it had a name. Financial elder abuse, in my own family, by the man my daughter had married. She also told me something else. She said that before we could move forward, she'd want to gather as much evidence as possible about the intent behind the arrangement. When the documents were signed, what was said, whether there had been any undue influence, she said these cases were hard to prove without corroboration. I didn't know where to find that. And then a package arrived in the mail. It came about 6 weeks after the funeral. A padded envelope, postmarked from a law office in Kanata. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note on the kind of notepaper Patricia used to keep in her bedside drawer. The handwriting was hers. I recognized it before I even read the words. "James, I'm sorry I didn't tell you while I could. I didn't want to scare you, and I was afraid of what you would do. But I also couldn't leave without making sure you were protected. The password is in the recipe box. I love you more than you'll ever know." I had to sit down. I went to the kitchen. The old recipe box, wooden, painted blue, slightly battered, sat on the second shelf where it had always sat. Inside, on a folded piece of paper tucked behind her mother's butter tart recipe, was a password. I plugged in the USB drive. There were 31 files. Some were documents. Scanned copies of correspondence, of financial records, of emails she had printed and photographed. Some were audio files, recordings she had made on her phone of conversations with Trevor, and some were videos. Short ones, most of them. She'd recorded them sitting at the desk in the spare room, the one she used when she wanted quiet, the small room with the blue curtain. In the first video, she looked tired. This was maybe 8 months before she died, I think. The way she held her shoulders, the kind of careful stillness she had started to carry with her toward the end. But her voice was steady. She said, "James, if you're watching this, then something happened the way I was afraid it might. I need you to know that I did not agree to what Trevor told you I agreed to. I did not understand what I was signing. And when I figured out what had been done, I started keeping records. I watched every file that night. I didn't sleep. Ryan was staying in the spare room, and at some point, around 2 in the morning, he came and found me at the desk, and I handed him the headphones, and he sat down and he listened, and after a while, He put his head in his hands. What Patricia had documented, carefully and methodically over the course of nearly a year, was everything. Emails from Trevor to a property development contact discussing the Ottawa asset and projected timelines contingent on her death. A recorded phone call in which Trevor told someone that the old man wouldn't be a problem, that everything was already arranged. Financial records showing that money had already been quietly moved from accounts I thought were still in both our names. She had taken all of it to a solicitor in Kanata, a friend of a friend, someone Trevor had never met and didn't know about, and arranged for it to be sent to me after she was gone. She had written a sworn affidavit, witnessed and notarized, describing in her own words what had happened and what she believed Trevor's intentions were. She had done all of this while she was dying, while I was sitting beside her hospital bed, thinking I was the one taking care of her. I have never felt so many things at once in my life. Ryan and I brought everything to our lawyer the next morning. She went quiet for a long time when she read through it. Then she looked up and said, "This is exceptional documentation. This changes everything. It took time." I want to be honest about that. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. And there were days when I wasn't sure it would work. Estate litigation in Ontario is slow and expensive and emotionally brutal. There were months when I was staying in a rented room in a friend's basement in Nepean. A man I'd known since we were both young engineers who made terrible coffee and watched hockey too loud and was exactly the kind of friend a person needs when everything is fallen apart. His name was Douglas, and I will owe him for the rest of my life. The case moved forward. Patricia's affidavit and the recorded conversations were central. Trevor's lawyers tried to argue the recordings were inadmissible. Ontario has specific rules about consent, but our lawyer had anticipated this. Patricia had made the recordings in context that fit within the law, and she had documented why. She had thought of everything. Trevor was investigated by 2 the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada. The financial manipulation in how our accounts had been restructured was a separate matter from the estate dispute, and it was serious. He had misrepresented the nature of the trust arrangement to both Patricia and me. He had a fiduciary duty as our advisor that he had violated badly. About 14 months after Patricia died, a settlement was reached. The house was returned to the estate. My share, as the surviving spouse and original co-owner, was protected. The financial accounts that had been restructured were unwound. Trevor lost his license to practice. He and Allison separated 6 months later. I don't know all the details, and I didn't ask. What I do know is that Allison called me on a Tuesday evening in February, almost 2 years after the funeral. I almost didn't answer. I stood in Douglas's kitchen holding the phone, watching the call display, and I thought about letting it go to voicemail. I answered. She was crying before I said a word. She said, "Dad, I didn't know. I need you to believe me. I didn't know most of what he was doing. I thought he told me the arrangement was Mum's idea, that she wanted it this way, that she'd asked for it. I didn't know about the emails. I didn't know about the money. I swear to you I didn't know." I believed her. Not completely, not right away. But over time, I came to believe that Allison had been manipulated in her own way, that Trevor had kept her partially informed, just enough to get her compliance, not enough for her to understand the full picture. She had said the words to me in that hallway because he had coached her to say them. She had believed what he told her. That doesn't erase what happened. I spent months in someone else's basement because of a document she handed me. But she is my daughter, and I loved her before Trevor ever entered our lives. And grief is complicated, and so is forgiveness. We had dinner together for the first time last spring. Just the two of us, at a small Italian place near the Glebe that Patricia had always liked. We didn't talk about Trevor. We talked about her mother. We talked about the butter tarts in the recipe box, in the yellow kitchen, in the hockey games her mother had pretended to watch just to be in the same room as us. We cried a little. We laughed a little. She walked me to my car afterward and hugged me for a long time in the parking lot. I moved back into the house in the autumn, stood in the hallway with my bags, and just stood there for a few minutes, breathing. The ring stain on the kitchen table was still there, The recipe box was still on the second shelf. I've thought a lot about what Patricia did, about the quiet courage of it, sitting alone in that spare room with the blue curtain, recording conversations, scanning documents, building a case while she was running out of time. She never told me, because she knew I would have been too angry, too loud, too obvious. She knew me. She knew I would have confronted Trevor directly and tipped everything over before the evidence was in place. So she did it herself, in secret, with a methodical patience that had always been the better part of who she was. She protected me after she was gone. There's a video near the end of the drive. The last one she recorded, I think. She's sitting at the desk, and she's wearing the blue cardigan she liked. And she looks tired but calm. The way she looked on good days near the end, when the pain was managed and she had a few quiet hours. She looks at the camera for a moment before she speaks, like she's collecting herself. She says, "I know this is a lot to take in. I know you're probably angry, and I know you're probably sad, and I know you're probably wishing I told you sooner. But James, I needed you to be okay. And you are. You're going to be okay. Take care of the kids. Take care of yourself. And for heaven's sake, use a coaster." I laughed. I was crying and I laughed. I put that video on a small USB drive and gave a copy to Ryan, and he called me the next day and couldn't say much, just, "She was something else, Dad." She was. She really was. I still use a coaster now. Every single time. It's the least I can do. I still think about Patricia sitting alone in that spare room with the blue curtain. Recording. Scanning. Organizing. While I was down the hall worrying about her medication schedule and whether she'd eaten enough that day, she was quietly building something that would outlast her, a wall of protection around a man who didn't even know he needed it yet. There's a version of this story where she said nothing and I lost everything. The house, the savings, 31 years of a life we built together. And the difficult truth I've had to sit with is that some of that would have been my own fault. I signed documents I didn't read carefully enough. I extended trust to someone who had not earned it because I was tired and frightened, and it was easier to let someone else handle it. That's not Trevor's doing. That's mine. I've had to own that. What Trevor did was wrong. Deliberately, calculatedly wrong. A man who uses someone's grief as cover for theft, who manipulates a dying woman's signature, who coaches his own wife to deliver the blow. That kind of choices has a way of finding its way back around, not because the universe is keeping score in any mystical sense, but because that kind of person leaves a trail. Patterns. Records. Witnesses. Patricia understood that. She understood that dishonesty at that scale cannot sustain itself indefinitely, and so she made sure there would be a record when it finally came apart. She was smarter than all of us. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I used to think of her as the warmer one, the more emotional one, and she was those things. But she was also the most clear-headed person I have ever known. While I would have gone straight at Trevor and made noise and given him time to cover his tracks, she went quiet. She gathered. She planned with a kind of patient precision that I could never have managed, especially not while dying. That took something I can only describe as real strength, not the loud kind. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that sits down and does the next necessary thing, even when it's hard, and even when you're scared, and even when you know you're running out of time. I think about what I want to carry forward from all of this. Not the bitterness. I've tried hard to put that down, because it's heavy and it doesn't help anyone. What I want to carry is what Patricia modeled for me in those files. The idea that doing the right thing is worth doing, even when no one is watching. That keeping your integrity when it costs you something is the only version of integrity that actually means anything, and that clear thinking. The willingness to slow down, to understand what you're actually agreeing to not let exhaustion become an excuse for carelessness. That clear thinking is something we owe ourselves and the people who depend on us. Allison and I are still finding our way back to each other. It's slow. Some dinners are easier than others. But she's trying, and so am I, and I think Patricia would have wanted that. She was the kind of woman who believed that people could be more than their worst moments. that love was worth the work of repair. The recipe box still sits on the second shelf. I haven't moved it. I don't think I ever will.